Okay, so everyone, thank you for coming tonight. I'm going to go ahead and get introducing Jane and our topic tonight, even though some people are still filing in. So good evening and thank you for joining us tonight. I'm Nancy McComb, one of the librarians here in Chelmsford. For those of you tuning into these talks for the first time, our presenter is Jane O'Neill, and she's been presenting our talks online for us for about 2 years now. Jane holds a master's in art history from Boston University and a master's in education from the Harvard University Graduate School of Education. She's a New Hampshire native and has worked at some of the state's most esteemed cultural institutions, including the League of New Hampshire Craftsmen, where she served as executive director, and the Currier Museum of Art, where she held the role of senior educator. Jane founded the Currier's Alzheimer's Cafe and led the tour program for the museum and the Frank Lloyd Wright designed Zimmerman House. She has taught art history at the college level for more than a decade, most recently at the New Hampshire Institute of Art. Her nonprofit, Culturally Curious, has a mission to engage, educate, and unify groups through facilitated arts experiences that inspire joy and foster critical and creative thinking, as well as an appreciation for our shared humanity. Tonight's talk is called Self-Portraits and Shifting Identities. Artists have hidden self-portraits in their works for centuries, but photographer Cindy Sherman's selfies take center stage and stand out for their cinematic quality. Sherman plays with makeup, costumes, setting, and lighting to create images that look like film stills. In this presentation, we will learn more about this artist, her body of work, and her influences. So please send any questions that you have for Jane into the chat, and they will be answered at the end of the program. So thank you all for coming, and welcome, Jane.
Thank you so much, Nancy. And thank you to everybody who's taking time out of their night tonight to learn a little bit more about Cindy Sherman and this incredible body of work that she has. This is, of course, self-portrait by Cindy Sherman. She would actually not even call these self-portraits. She would say that these are in no way images of herself, although she always serves as the model. In this case, she has a rear projection behind her of this street view, and we can see that she's looking sideways while pushing a bike forward. So you can sort of begin to tell a little story about what you see here, but we'll see that she transforms herself in virtually every photograph that we're going to be looking at. So tonight we'll have the absolute pleasure of getting to know Cindy Sherman a little bit more, getting to know her body of work a little bit more. And this is really the perfect time of year to be thinking about her work, a chilly October evening like this, because Cindy Sherman once said, "I wish I could treat every day as Halloween and get dressed up and go out into the world as some eccentric character." And we'll see soon enough that that is pretty much her, her approach to art making. So let me give you a sense in terms of how we'll spend this next hour together. Here's another portrait by the artist from about 25 years later. So she has a nice long career and can really come into an entirely new character. As we can see, we went from some sort of shifty character before to almost like an aging screen actress in this image. All right, so we're going to get started thinking about selfies in art in general, sort of a quick overview of that history, beginning with the Renaissance. Then we'll turn our attention to Cindy Sherman and get an introduction to her early life and some of her influences and how she got started doing this work. And then the way she produces her images is that she tends to work in series. So we're going to get little snapshots of different series over the course of the evening. This is not an exhaustive overview of her photographic work. That would take a really long time. She's into her 5th decade of image making at this point, but I feel like we'll see, I think a lot of her most famous images, and honestly, a lot of her most beautiful images. This is a woman who is not afraid to take on the guise of a pretty ugly and sometimes even like offensive looking character. And some of these images are just really tough to look at. So I've chosen the images that I really love to look at. So we'll be staying in a pretty generally beautiful lane, generally. All right, so let's get started thinking about selfies in art. And we're going to be taking this brief overview of the past 500 years or so. Why the past 500 years, you might be saying? It's because it was only about 500 100 years ago that mirrors began to proliferate, that the average person could own their own mirror. So that's why we begin to see artists like Albert Dürer here creating so many self-portraits. And this is his famous self-portrait from the year 1500. And if you think he looks sort of familiar here, that's completely intended, because Albert Dürer is presenting himself essentially in the guise of Jesus Christ. He's got the long brown hair, he's got the beard, he looks like a European interpretation really of Jesus. In addition to that, this is a rigidly frontal image, and it almost looks as though, with this delicate gesture of his hand here, that he is about to bless us or something like this. So he is playing up these associations that we already have with this kind of pose, with this kind of composition, this format. And we'll see Cindy Sherman does similar things with her work. Plenty of dress up today for sure. We're going to turn our attention now to another very well-known selfie from around the same period. This is one of various self-portraits in the Sistine Chapel complex, painted by the famous Renaissance artist Michelangelo. Now, he was called back decades after he finished the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel to paint the east end of the chapel with a Last Judgment fresco. We can see over here on the left that at the center of this fresco is Jesus, and he's flanked by Mary, and then just surrounded by all of these saints up in heaven. And even if they're not wearing very much clothing, they usually have the attributes that help to identify them. And these attributes are usually decided by, because they are the instruments of these individuals' martyrdom. So in this case, we're looking at Saint Bartholomew over here, and he sits just to the left of Jesus, our right. Saint Bartholomew is holding a knife here because he was actually flayed alive. His skin was cut off of him. And so he's, in addition to holding the knife, he's holding his skin. And it's generally believed that this is a self-portrait by Michelangelo that he included in this detached skin of Saint Bartholomew. So that might prompt us to think a little bit about the circumstances of his life and the commission of this Last Judgment fresco, that Michelangelo might feel any sort of kinship to a flayed saint. But once again, playing up these associations that we might have with already established figures and modes of representation. The next self-portrait I wanted to introduce you to is from the next major period of Italian art, which is the Baroque. And this is thought to be a self-portrait of the young Baroque master Caravaggio. And in this case, he is presenting himself to us as the young, sick Bacchus, or god of wine, god of good times here. So he is wearing a toga, he's clutching some grapes to reference winemaking, of course, but he has this kind of yellowed skin, he's got these white lips. In actuality, we know that the artist had just been hospitalized for about 6 months due to malaria. So it's a really interesting choice to show yourself as like the god of partying, essentially, but sort of looking like you're hung over. So once again, we're seeing an artist playing up associations, wearing a costume, playing a part for us. And in this case, it is supposed to give us, I think, some sort of insight into who this artist was. In this case, I think it was a great way for him to make a comeback after this illness. Now, these next two images that we have here are self-portraits of the Dutch Baroque artist Rembrandt, and then a self-portrait over here by the French realist artist Gustave Courbet. And with these very dramatic images that we're looking at, these kind of shocked, exaggerated expressions in both of these images, even though they're separated by about 200 years, we can see a tradition in self-portraiture where artists are sort of leaning into the drama. When it comes to Rembrandt, he is sort of participating in in a type of portrait making called a trony. And tronies back then were experiments for artists. It was an opportunity to show exaggerated facial expressions. So there are a couple of different self-portraits of Rembrandt out there making these sort of over-the-top expressions that you would never see in a formal portrait. But I particularly like this look of shock with the little pursed lips here. On the right, we have this incredible self-portrait by Courbet. It's called The Desperate Man. It dates to 1843. I mean, if this image doesn't just grab you, I don't know what will. I think it's interesting that the title is not, self-portrait, but in fact, The Desperate Man. It seems as though he's portraying someone other than himself, that he's once again playing a part and trying to convey a deep emotional state that doesn't necessarily reflect who he is. So these images are to remind us that the self-portraits are so very much a construction and not always necessarily a mirror. We'll see Cindy Sherman adopt similar methods in her self-portraits as we go through the night. Now, Vincent van Gogh is so famous for his self-portraits, dozens of self-portraits over his very short career. And oftentimes we see this incredible kind of psychological penetration when it comes to these works. There isn't that same artifice that we were just looking at with Rembrandt and Courbet. This is a penetrating look at sort of where he is emotionally in this world. And I think he emphasizes this psychological state by these short blue brushstrokes surrounding his head that then are also seen on his face as well, around his eyes and up here on his temples. It is almost like a state of emotional distress here that you rarely see in many of his self-portraits, but it is conveyed with this kind of unfocused gaze, but also a penetrating gaze here. We'll see Cindy Sherman will adopt a similar power in many of her works. Is it acting? Is it based on her own experiences? We'll see. And in some cases, we get to decide. Now we'll round out our look at self-portraits with just two last artists. And we have Frida Kahlo's world famous Two Fridas from 1939 here on the screen. And this is a double self-portrait by the artist where she shows herself twice, linked together by these arteries connecting her two hearts. And then also her two selves are holding each other's hands. I wanted to bring in this image because Frida Kahlo is really defining these two sides of her personality through these wardrobe choices, really an old-fashioned European Victorian style wedding dress over here and the clothes of a modern or contemporary Mexican woman. So wardrobe choice or costume is all important. And we'll see that for Cindy Sherman, it sort of makes or breaks a whole series of images. All right, the very last art historical self-portrait that we'll look at are Andy Warhol's 1981 Polaroids. And yes, we are looking at Andy Warhol in drag here. He's using makeup and wigs, not just to hide the imperfections in his skin or his receding hairline, all these things that he perceived as being major flaws in his appearance. He is masking that to a certain degree, but he's using these elements to change his gender, to assume a new identity. I mean, all of these images are linked sort of by this bright red lipstick, but with every Polaroid, he's a new person. He's in a new pose. He's engaging with us, the viewer, in an entirely new way. And perhaps this is the best segue to Cindy Sherman, because I should mention she does something very similar to this, but she was doing it before Warhol. So let me introduce you to the chameleon that is Cindy Sherman. These are two actual portraits of what she looks like in fairly recent times. I do love this photograph of her over here with a smartphone. Smartphones have really only entered into her artistic practice in the last few years. So we'll talk a little bit about the kind of camera work she was doing along the way, but the photographic process was not the most important part of her work. So Cindy Sherman was born in 1954. She grew up on Long Island, New York, and she was the youngest of 5 children. Now, she came along really late in the life of her family. Her next oldest sibling is 9 years older than her. So she said when she was growing up, it sort of felt like there was an already established family, and she was sort of like this outsider or intruder. And in some ways, dressing up, playing a character, playing a part was a way for her to say, you know, remember me? Do you like this version of me? I can be a part of this group too. She was dressing up essentially to woo them. So dress up was a huge part of her identity, even as a young girl. By the time she was a teenager, apparently she had amassed a huge collection of prom dresses from various thrift shops. But we can see here in a photograph from when she was just 12 years old, she's the girl on the left over here. She's with her friend Janet, that she was already really interested in trying on different identities. Now, Cindy Sherman came of age in the 1960s and 70s, and this is, of course, a period that's shaped by so much political and cultural upheaval, including the rise of feminism and this whole new way of understanding women's roles in the world, a less restrictive understanding of women's identities and the roles that they play in society. And for Cindy Sherman, this was hugely influential because she was really part of this generation, this first generation that was raised by TV in so many ways. These media this media informed experience of how women look and how women behave really sort of shaped her young identity. She talked about how as a teenager, she was ironing her hair, she wore a girdle every day, she wore a full face of makeup because you never know who's knocking at the door. She described herself as really being obsessed with her appearance. This is such a great image because she's probably just a little bit younger than this, younger than that moment where she becomes obsessed. There's no real self-consciousness in an image like this with the two girls that are dressed up as old ladies. Notice too that it doesn't really look like it's October. I think they're just dressing up for fun. It's not necessarily Halloween here. Now, Cindy Sherman heads off to college in 1972. She goes to Buffalo State College, and this whole new cultural revolution is already in swing. She said no self-respecting liberated woman was wearing makeup. They weren't dyeing their hair, and a lot of them weren't wearing bras. And these were all things that Cindy Sherman was pretty accustomed to doing, but there was an emphasis on being all natural. So when she started her college education, she went to school to study painting, and she became frustrated by painting's limitations pretty early on. Apparently, she was an excellent copyist, but she felt like everything that could be said with painting really had already been said. So she abandons it and takes up photography. This is an early project that she did as a photography student. Now, it's called the Cindy book, I should mention, and I'll tell you a little bit more about it in just a second. But I think it's important to note that Cindy Sherman actually failed her first course of photography when she was in college. She was forced to repeat it, and she came under the tutelage of Barbara Jo Revelle, who was the first person to introduce Cindy Sherman to conceptualism, that art can be about the idea as much as it is about the execution of the idea. And this is, a big movement in the 20th century. And Sherman said right away, that made so much more sense to me. So what we're looking at with the Cindy book, this student project, is she went home to Long Island. She found these photo albums where she had meticulously circled her own image in various family photos. And then as a child wrote, "That's me, that's me, that's me," under all of these images. And so it's even at an early age, she's sort of grappling with the separation of her lived self and the self that's being captured in a photograph. And I think that split there is something that she's sort of always chasing in her artistic output. So Cindy Sherman really loves this idea of photography being deceiving. She said, I know the camera always lies. And she likes the idea of marrying that deception to her love of clothes and makeup. All right, so we begin to see sort of the hallmarks of her work as she's a student. We're looking at 23 photographs beginning up here on the left and scrolling all the way down to the lower right here. And in these 23 photographs, we see a transformation. That transformation is the artwork. This is the idea taking root. Photography is just part of the process. It's like her face has become the canvas, literally here. So Cindy Sherman even talked about, observing people and then being able to copy their face on hers. Now, she's someone who's always been drawn to television, and it's really kind of unique power in our culture. Cindy Sherman is much less concerned with the influence of fine art. She likes this close association to something that is immediately accessible to people. And so she regarded photography as this apt form of expression in a media and image saturated society. So we can see this kind of wonderful transformation from this kind of bookish, nerdy character over here to almost like a vamp down here in the corner with a painted face and a cigarette and a choker. Now, once again, if we compare that to Andy Warhol, Cindy Sherman was documenting these transformations about a decade before Andy Warhol was. Her student work is really remarkable. These are all images of Cindy Sherman. These are all images of her choosing costumes and applying makeup in such a way to completely transform herself. And I think this goes back to this idea of using her face as a canvas, using her abilities to paint like a copyist to turn herself into someone. And these were always characters that were sort of inspired by her close observation of others. Occasionally, she would do a celebrity. This is her great Lucille Ball from 1975. But for the most part, she's sort of interested in not specifics, but more like archetypes, things that seem really familiar, but aren't quite exactly what you've seen before. And that leads us to one of her very first series, which I think is endlessly fascinating. It's called the Bus Rider series from 1976. She is still a student as she does this. So this is a series where Cindy Sherman has found all of the clothes, done all of the makeup, done all of the storytelling, done all of the modeling, and all of the photography to essentially embody all of the different people you might see while you're riding the bus. So we see some characters who are sitting down and facing you directly. Some of these characters are standing with their hands up, raised up over their head as though they're, grabbing something to hold on to in the bus. And we'll even see some figures who are sitting in profile compared to where we would presumably be sitting. Now, let me just zoom in on a couple of details here. Cindy Sherman was really interested in capturing the details of people's lives. So she was going to thrift stores and flea markets to get exactly what she was looking for. Think about the last time you dressed up for Halloween. Most people don't just go to a Halloween store, buy a costume and be done. For many people, it's about like the thrill of the hunt, finding the exact right thing to make your costume just sing, to fully embody the character that you want to be. So she was finding props and wigs and makeup and clothes for all of these characters. And like I said, she represents them herself. And she worked alone. She wasn't getting any help from anyone. Now, I think it's worth noting that yes, she was in blackface. She completely painted her face, her body, in order to try and capture the diversity that she was seeing on buses at the time. Yes, this is awful. And I think somebody must have told her this because she never does it again. But this series was not actually exhibited until 2000. So like I said, she did it in 1976 as a young possibly naive college student, and it was still publicly exhibited within the past 25 years. And I will show you what the way she characterized this work to the public. It was sort of stopping short of an apology for it. She said, I made this body of work. When I made this body of work, my intention was to be inclusive, and the bus riders I was basing my work on were both Black and white. Contrary to what has been intimated, I did not use several shades for the white characters and only one for the Black characters. For all characters, I used my limited knowledge and makeup at the time for showing difference in age and sex. In 1976, I was 22, naive, and unaware of potential offense in these characters. So like I said, she doesn't really completely apologize for this, which I struggle with a little bit. But like I said, she seemed to have learned her lesson and really never did it again. One last character here that I wanted to show you from the Bus Rider series. It almost looks like someone who's sitting across the aisle from you on the bus. I want to point out that the makeup here is like stage makeup. There's almost a theatricality to it. It's visible. We're aware of the fact that there's makeup here to transform this character, this woman or this model, into a specific character. I also want to draw your attention to the fact that we can see the markings on the floor here. Again, there's like this theater element to what she's doing, and even shoes that she has discarded from another character are still visible in the shot. And you might be thinking, well, isn't that just sloppiness? Do we really have to think of that as like an artful decision? In the case of Cindy Sherman, we do think of it as an artful decision, because once again, she's showing us sort of the dress up process here. Now, the one last detail that I really love in these early photographs by Cindy Sherman is that there was no timer on her camera. And so instead she had a little button that she would press to take the photograph. And that button was connected to the camera by a wire. So in a lot of her early images, you can find the wire and find the button. In this case, she was stepping on it with her foot, which is kind of fun. All right, so it will be hunting for those wires in the next few images here as we turn our attention to her untitled film stills. And this was a project that she took on right after graduating from college. She and her boyfriend, the artist Robert Longo, moved to New York City and sort of give birth together almost to this series. Now, Cindy Sherman never titles her work. There's not a name for any of these photographs. The gallery that represents her gives them all numbers. So it's probably pretty meaningless for me to be like a number 153 here. So we just have untitled work after untitled work. So let's get a sense of what the untitled film stills look like. So we have Cindy Sherman playing dress up. This untitled film stills from beginning in the late 1970s. It's a suite of 75 Black and white images where we have the artist posing in various sort of generic female types that you might see in B Hollywood movies or in art house movies or in film noir. These images were crafted to look like the kind of cheaply produced film stills that would be widely distributed to publicize a film. And with these images that Cindy Sherman was making, once again, it's supposed to be someone that we almost feel like we recognize and a story that we could almost fill in the blanks for. So in this case, she's wearing what I think is like a 1960s suit. She's in a city setting here, but it's an open square. She is looking at something that she is really responding to in this case. And it's a little bit hard to read it, whether it's fear or disgust, but it is a beautifully arranged or composed photograph where she is taking up only just this right third of the image. And I think that is the black cord and the button in her hand over here. Now, it's pretty unusual in this whole suite of images to see her in the same costume twice, but this is a different angle, the same costume, same hat, same sort of graphic eyeliner here. And I think that this is a much more successful image, or it appeals to me in so many ways, because the photograph is being shot from below. We really understand that she's in a metropolitan area But with this image, we can't see how many people are around her. Once again, she has this very sort of unsettled, uneasy expression on her face. And all of a sudden, you feel like you're in an Alfred Hitchcock movie, and she is like the young ingenue who's being pursued or something. She's vulnerable in this moment, in this photograph. So, so her boyfriend, Robert Longo, sort of helped her to develop this concept. He said that when they moved to New York City, and Cindy Sherman has corroborated this too, that she was really kind of fearful of the city itself. When they first got there, it was the summer of Sam. She used to dress up like a man, really, to leave the house a lot of the time. So she would stay inside, dress up with the clothes in her closet, and sort of take on these different characters. And her boyfriend, this artist, Robert Longo, sort of said, "You're onto something here. Let's start photographing them." So they'd hop in the back of a van, they'd go around the city scouting these different locations. Sometimes he took some of these early photographs, sometimes she did, but generally speaking, she is understood to be the author of all of them. These are all characters that she invented and images that she crafts. Here's another untitled film still from the same series, and we can see once again that her sort of innate ability to suggest a story but not necessarily tell a story. She's got this short, dark wig on here, once again with really dark eyeliner. It's a 1960s skirt with the high boots, and she is crouching on the floor here in a kitchen with a ripped open brown paper bag full of groceries. She's not looking at the groceries, even though she's holding the eggs in her hand. She is looking up and off to the side. And maybe right now in your heads, you're thinking, okay, who's she looking at? Is she looking at somebody she's in conflict with? Is it a lover? Is it a boyfriend? Is it a husband? What is about to unfold next? So, so once again, we have the delight of finding the black wire over here. And I should mention that she composed a lot of these images actually using photography, or I'm sorry, not photography, using mirrors. Most often this was a pretty isolated process for her. Oh, as I'm looking at this now too, it looks as though there's a bruise on her wrist here, and who knows if that's makeup or if that was something that already existed, but I feel like it might have been a choice on her part. A lot of the women in these untitled film stills are vulnerable characters. In this case, we see a woman in a bathrobe who's pressed herself against the wall of this bedroom here. And on the bed is an open suitcase. She looks like she has just gotten into a fight with a husband, a boyfriend, a lover, and she is packing in the middle of the night, stopping to sob or perhaps sort of back away from someone who has just entered the room here. And Cindy Sherman once said, "While I work, I might feel as tormented as the people I'm portraying." So there's a little bit of acting that goes along with this. And Andy Warhol himself said she's good enough to be a real actress. She's really tapping into something. Every time I look at this image, I'm like, how is this the same person? She looks so different. So a lot of the untitled film stills are about women in precarious or dangerous situations, these female archetypes that never tell us the full story, but really set the stage so that our brains can activate and populate the story however we desire. Sherman said, "The still must tease with the promise of the story the viewer is itching to be told." I think that is a particularly fitting quote for this image over here on the left. I'm really drawn to this image where Cindy Sherman is wearing this little black dress with a black lace overlay. She's in an apartment type setting, and we can see her standing here with one hand to her neck, sort of a protective pose. And I'm not exactly sure what's in her other hand. It sort of looks like the shape of a knife or a blade, but it could be an umbrella. It's hard to say. But I feel like the secret to really enjoying this image is to look at the mirror behind her, which is reflecting the space essentially that we occupy as viewers. And we can see that this table here has a seat at it that's across from Cindy Sherman. It has a jacket slung over the seat, and it has a cocktail glass there. So it's as though she was on a date or she was interacting with someone, and at this very moment she's kind of stood up and is maybe getting ready to leave. Maybe there was some sort of offense, maybe there was some sort of attack. And attack certainly translates to the next image over here on the right as well. Cindy Sherman is showing us herself with two huge black eyes and even another bruise on her cheek here. She's got another short wig on, and the way she's cropped the image, we're not even certain that she's wearing any clothes. This is a bruised and battered woman here who looks out directly sort of above us, above the camera. It's as though she's looking at somebody who is kind of dominating her, intimidating her, and her mouth is open as though she's kind of pleading for something to stop, pleading for an end to this. Behind her are these two huge windows with these black panes of glass. It's the middle of the night. It's another story that's dying to be told, of course. So we'll end with a little bit of a palate cleanser, not quite a vulnerable woman as so many of these other images have been. I think that this is a favorite from this series for a lot of people because you sort of imagine she's having a lot of fun making this image. And like I said, Cindy Sherman was not trying to make high art. She had no interest in using paint. She just wanted to find something that everybody could relate to. She didn't want it to have any sort of precious or archival quality to it. She just didn't want her work to be a commodity, but she wanted to create things that could resonate. So with this image, she is posing in a slip with these like thigh-high stockings, and she's kind of clumsily pushing back this curtain in front of a sliding glass door. She's holding it open with an elbow, but at the same time grasping the top of this martini glass. And that kind of sloppy movement of the drapery here is sort of echoed with her other hand in the way that she's kind of lifting up her skirt and hiking up that material there. She leans forward, she's got these dark sunglasses on, and it's almost as though she's peering at us, like seeing if there's any sort of sense of recognition here. Now she is leaning out of a dark hotel room into bright sunlight. And you sort of begin to imagine, is this the night after some sort of wild escapade, or is the party just now beginning? There's another person in this image, but we don't know much about them. Their face is obscured by this wide brimmed hat. So once again, Cindy Sherman is sort of teeing us up to begin thinking about who this character might be and what are the circumstances of this particular setting and this particular pose. All right, so before we leave the untitled film stills, I think it's sort of fun to mention that about 2 decades after this series, Cindy Sherman actually directed a film herself with a couple of really well-known female actors. And it's interesting to think about her directing other women to perform in a film. Unfortunately, it was not very well received, but it is a horror flick. So if anybody wanted to watch it this month and get a little scare out of it, apparently this wasn't her medium. She's better at directing herself, maybe. So let's turn our attention to a series that came shortly after the Untitled Film series, and it's known as The Centerfolds from 1981. Now, Cindy Sherman was invited by the Magazine Art Forum to create a series of images that respond to the format and the idea of the magazine centerfold. And oftentimes when we think about magazine centerfolds, we might be thinking about fashion magazines, but for the most part, it's pornographic magazines. And Cindy Sherman did these photographs large scale, 2 feet by 4 feet, and it's that same sort of aspect ratio. And instead of what you might imagine seeing if you were to open up a pornographic magazine, she offers up something that is really different, something that sort of stops you short. There's no soft lighting, there's no come hither gaze. There's really nothing sensual about these images. And this particular image, we have her kind of spotlit with this harsh lighting. She almost looks as though she's lying on the floor. She doesn't look comfortable. She looks disheveled. Her hair is messy. Her skin is wet. It looks as though she's wearing the clothes she slept in, and her whole body isn't even contained by this long format either. She seems to be sort of spilling out of it. When I look at this, I almost feel like she's like a woman that's been snatched in the night and being held captive. But maybe I've watched too many true crime movies over in my lifetime. But most of these images in this series sort of have that same feeling of a woman who's trapped, a woman who is in an uncomfortable situation. Once again, we have a woman here with short, wet, disheveled hair, a kilt in this case, sort of suggesting that she might be a really young girl. And notice how her hands are sort of splayed on these floorboards here. It seems as though this is kind of a defensive position. She's looking up and away to the side as though she's engaging with someone who's speaking to her. We can see here too that the floorboards are painted, but only to a point. The lighting here seems to be on the specific part of the floor, and she's been planted there. She seems incredibly uneasy. And so once again, this series was really supposed to be jarring to people that looked at it. It was so jarring to the magazine Art Forum, though, they decided not to publish these works. They thought people wouldn't really understand them, or perhaps misunderstand them if they were actually published. So she's really pushing beyond the conceptual framework of what we think of as a centerfold. Just a few more of these images. Of course, she's trying to kind of summon the likeness of a very young, kind of innocent girls, sometimes sort of awkward looking girls. Almost all of these women are on these hardwood floors. In this case, we have one that is lying down. The only softness here are like these towels, these hand towels that are on the ground here. We see a little bit of her flesh here with her legs exposed and a little bit of her midriff, but she looks up and away. There's like a wistfulness in her face here as she looks up towards where the light is entering this room. And this sort of looks like a daytime photograph as opposed to this image over here on the right, where once again, Cindy Sherman is on the floor on these painted floorboards, and all around her is this deep, dark shadow. We see a young girl in a gingham dress with sort of disheveled hair and in an uneasy pose. It's almost as though she's kind of retreating into herself and peering out into the shadows at a disembodied voice. These are like the stories that I start adding to it as I'm looking at these images. There's just a lot to unpack here. She leaves it so open, but at the same time, she is creating something that clicks and connects. It's images that are part of our visual vocabulary that we so closely associate with movies and with TV. So one of the last centerfold issues or centerfold images I wanted to share with you is this one here. It's probably the most well-known work from the series because in 2011, it was auctioned off for close to $4 million. Incidentally, Cindy Sherman is the first female artist ever to sell a photograph for more than $1 million. And so this was really a groundbreaking sale for her. Now, this one I have a special affinity for because this linoleum was my neighbor's kitchen floor my entire childhood. So there's something a lot more, to me, just benign about this scene. And I think that's the same is true for Cindy Sherman's interpretation of it. She said, when talking about the composition, she said, I was thinking of a young girl who may have been cleaning the kitchen for her mother, who ripped something out of the newspaper, something asking, are you lonely? Or do you want to be friends? Or do you want to go on vacation? She's cleaning the floor, she rips this out, and she's thinking about it. So she doesn't seem quite as vulnerable, but we have this wonderful kind of mix of the patterns of the linoleum and the gingham here, and of course her orange sweater and her very sort of made up peachy face here as well. It just makes for a really interesting composition. With this last image here, you can see the artist in her studio with that same linoleum floor just beyond her here. Interesting to think about what that setup was in order to create an image like this. Cindy Sherman, I should add, is wearing a wig in this scene, and I think we're going to see the wig in this next photograph as we begin looking at her series on fairy tales from just a few years later. There's that wig, I think. Cindy Sherman was invited by Vanity Fair to publish a series, and sort of like as we saw with Art Forum, this was another series that was so disturbing. They decided not to publish it. She was interested in fairy tales and the darker side of fairy tales, the kind of visceral, grotesque, dark side of stories like the Brothers Grimm and Aesop's fables. I love this image here because we have the reader of one of these, darker fairy tales, and Cindy Sherman is wearing these huge bug eyes here to exaggerate, a reaction to this story from somebody who seems otherwise pretty sweet and innocent, but she's become distorted. She's become unsettling, a little bit grotesque here. She is clutching this tattered leather-bound volume here, and it's as though with this twinkling starlight behind her, she's almost reading a story to us outside in this vulnerable setting, but notice how it's all electric light that is actually illuminating her. That light too creates this this ambiance in this scene, this kind of blue light that really, I mean, literally sets the tone. This is a haunting image in so many ways. I don't know if I can look at it for that much longer, but it doesn't get better when it comes to this series. This is a series where we see Cindy Sherman making full use of prosthetics, and she makes the prosthetics completely apparent. So in this case, she's wearing this little pig snout here, but you can easily see the line where the pig snout meets her face. She's also kind of dirtied and bloodied her face here. This character, sort of loosely inspired by fables, is lying on the ground, seemingly sort of beaten up or bloodied, and is kind of sucking on their own fingers over here. We have a sort of sinister, large-scale character who's perched up high somewhere with these tiny little human figures behind them. This character has short, dark hair and is sweating. He's sweating immensely. And I mean, all you can say is it has this giant tongue sticking out of its mouth. And once again, her fingers are involved with this prosthetic. She's sort of absent-mindedly licking her own fingers here. So there's this grotesque sensuality that goes along with a lot of these images. I had chosen this image to help publicize tonight's program. And it's one that I find so fascinating because I think Cindy Sherman does such a great job here of really making herself look dead. In this case, she's got this kind of pale, waxy skin. She's got the white wig on. She's lying in the dirt on the ground, and the dirt is, all over her face and neck. She's wearing a dress here that's also dirty and wet. She's got this glassy, unfocused stare. It's remarkable to just pause and think for a moment that we've only been looking at the same woman this entire time tonight. So Cindy Sherman, like I said before, didn't like the idea of her work being a commodity. She didn't like the idea of the fine art world in general. And she'd already become a little too much of a darling in the art world. So she was trying to purposely make things that would rub people the wrong way. She said, let's see if people put this over the dining room table. So she's definitely pushing buttons in this case. One critic commented on this work, she looks shocked by her own violent demise. That's a really good way to characterize it. In 2010, this photo sold for $2.7 million. So the last fairy tale work I'm going to show you, wow, what an image, is Cindy Sherman dressed up as this sort of golem type character. Now, so many of the images that we've seen of her in the 1980s, she's on the ground, sort of looking up and kind of vulnerable at almost like an imagined male viewer. But this is such a sinister, strange character that we see, who seems to be kind of desperately pawing these pebbles as though she's looking for some, some rare jewel in the midst of it. She is soaking wet. She's wearing these disheveled clothes, these strange stockings too, and has this grayed wig on. But it's this panda-like black eye makeup here, and these kind of shiny, rotting teeth, and the fact that she's looking right at us. It creates this fascinating push and pull in this image because it invites us in, and then we see what we're looking at and we're sort of repulsed by it. It's powerful image making, absolutely. And it's really unusual and fascinating choices on the part of the artist. Now, these images were generally well received by the critics. It might have been her inspiration for creating an illustrated children's book in 1992 based on the stories of the Brothers Grimm, featuring 15 of her photographs. And here's just a quick selection of what those images look like. Generally, when I was reading about the book, most of the critics said, this book was created for people under the age of 12, but the photographs don't really seem as though they're targeted for that age group. Pictures are stunning nonetheless. So we're going to start moving just a little bit quicker because we're running out of time. Cindy Sherman does a whole series of history portraits where she's playing with the history of art. And I have to say, I feel like she single-handedly made this entire series for me because I just love going through the different references that she's conjuring here. These are large-scale images. This is the artist standing in front of this work here. So in this case, we've got some nice references perhaps to the work of Leonardo da Vinci with the pose and in the hands in particular, and maybe even in the headdress. Notice how once again, she's using unblended makeup here, calling attention to the artifice that is this costuming that she's doing here. These aren't, especially made costumes. These are things that she's piecing together from scraps of fabric from junk stores, basically. She referred to them as being sort of junky. In this next image in the center, she is recalling the works of the French artist Ingres and these kind of luxurious aristocratic portraits that he made in the early 1800s. This wonderful, thoughtful pose here with the reflection of Madame Moitessier. And we can see a little call out to that in Cindy Sherman's picture as well. Moving along quickly, we can see Cindy Sherman is, in some cases, trying to conjure a specific person, trying to replicate them sort of in the same way that she did with Lucille Ball. In this case, this is a 1518 painting by the artist Raphael of his lover, and Cindy Sherman has transformed this young, sensual woman into someone entirely different because of this pointed expression on her face and the prosthetic breasts and fake belly that we can see here as well. So there's definitely a sort of disconnect and a discomfort in looking at a work like this. She also looked at images of violence, and throughout the history of art, you have artists like Botticelli over here on the left, who created images of the biblical heroine, Judith, who beheads the Assyrian general Holofernes. And so in this case, Cindy Sherman is, piecing together once again all of these different pattern cloths to get a sense of brocade here. She's got a grotesque head for the head of Holofernes. She's adopted this kind of vacant stare as though maybe we're supposed to be thinking about how she feels after beheading him. There is, of course, a knife in her other hand. And in so many ways, she's really kind of nailing the costume with this iridescent fabric. Notice that she's actually wearing fake feet here too, to emphasize once again, the artifice here, and how oftentimes in these older paintings, the hands and feet were much larger than they were in real life. So one last art historical reference photo for you, but she did so many other works in this series. Here we see her conjuring a specific image once again, and in this case, we already know it's Caravaggio's young, sick Bacchus. So she is taking on the identity of a male artist who's taking on the identity of the god of wine here. She's painted her own skin to make her look like she is sick. I'm not quite sure how she gets this incredible arm definition here. That might just be the magic of makeup, but everything, in almost every other way, she's wonderfully summoning the original scene here. So she goes on to do a really dramatically different work after the history portraits, because the history portraits, collectors loved them. It was like buying a historical painting and a modern contemporary work all in one. And she never wanted to be a commodity. So she would create really challenging images. Over here on the left is part of a series that she did called Sex Pictures from the 1990s. Art historians generally think about these prosthetic body parts, sort of these disintegrating bodies, as kind of being in response to the AIDS epidemic and in response to just being a darling in the art world. And then she did clowns. She did a lot of really disturbing looking clowns. Some of them are sexualized clowns. Some of them are just downright ugly clowns with the fake teeth. These are from the early 2000s. And while she's doing these more challenging images, she earned a MacArthur Genius Grant Award for $500,000. She's still getting all of this critical attention and celebration. So the last series that we'll wrap up with tonight is her series of society portraits from 2008. And this is a whole fascinating series, kind of circling back to those film stills in a lot of ways, because she is looking at these female archetypes that exist in our society today, these women who aren't necessarily trying to so desperately cling to their youth, but they are very much wedded to their positions of power and demonstrating their positions of power. So we've seen a lot of images that were, bordering on the grotesque, or maybe they were outright grotesque. But now Cindy Sherman is sort of interested in this more subtle artifice that goes along with these society portraits. She talked about how when she was first starting out in the field, 40 something years earlier, she was a young woman who was trying to add in the wrinkles. And now she has the wrinkles and she's trying to sort of see what she can do with them. In this case, we see this kind of pinched person, an older woman without a single gray hair here. We can see some loose flesh, some sort of crepey skin here. And notice how red her eyes are. This is not an accident. She's standing, she's, almost painfully slender here, and she is standing looking over her shoulder in a traditional sort of sensual pose, but there is, I don't know, there's like a harshness to this person. She doesn't seem soft. She doesn't seem alluring. The backdrop here, of course, reinforces this notion that she is from a rich and powerful background. A couple of other society portraits here. Once again, Cindy Sherman was leaning into this notion that these would be women who could have access to some cosmetic surgery, but that they don't necessarily overindulge in it. But we do see, these very big lips, these very high eyebrows, very smooth faces sometimes, but all of the trappings of their wealth and status surrounding them in these images. The last image that we'll go to, I remember I was reading about this series, and one author kept referencing the woman with the red eyes and the red lips. And then I stumbled across this image, and it really is shocking. And once again, it's hard to believe that this is Cindy Sherman. I'm pretty sure she's got a prosthetic nose here, or some really great makeup going on. Her eyebrows, her actual eyebrows have been painted out, and she's added in these kind of slightly asymmetrical, over overly plucked linear eyebrows here that that portray this kind of underlying neurosis in this character who looks out at us directly, bright red lips. And even though her face is fairly taut in terms of her skin, we do see the loose skin portraying betraying her age around her neck here. Using a fan like this is sort of a young kind of coquettish thing to do, but she's a woman who is standing sort of boldly in this almost what looks like a European castle-like setting, kind of owning her status, owning her wealth, confronting us directly with it. So Cindy Sherman is really kind of leaning into like these very subtle nuances in terms of class and this new archetype of these kind of powerful, rich women. So let's wrap up with kind of big ideas and where Cindy Sherman is at today. In 2017, when she was recovering from a horse riding accident, a friend of hers, I think it was actually her hairdresser, turned her on to using filters in social media. Before this, Cindy Sherman, who's like the queen of self-portraits, was not interested in selfies at all. She said that social media is so vulgar. But she became fascinated by using the filters that can distort your face or, add eyelashes or what have you. And she creates these really exaggerated images that almost remind me of Rembrandt and his Trony back there, something that really is like an experiment in how far you can push a particular pose or a concept. Cindy Sherman, with these digitally created images that have been altered through filters, she is leaning into the grotesque in an entirely new way. And she's posting all of these things on her Instagram account. So if you're on Insta, you can go and experience these works. I mean, I look over here and this sort of looks like a woman who could perhaps be like a cancer survivor here. We've got a very beautiful looking man, I think, with this large jaw, and then a completely sort of funhouse mirror distorted version of her over here. She is ever changing. Now, she was recently featured on the cover of the Wall Street Journal magazine, and you can see from the title why Cindy Sherman thinks selfies are a cry for help. She has a really complicated relationship with the idea of truly revealing herself. So even in this image, she's distorting her own likeness with the magnifying glass from her own studio. So as I've said throughout the night, none of these people that she's creating are her. They're all characters. She said if they ever got too close to her, to being her, she would reject them. A few years back, there was a retrospective of Cindy Sherman's work at MoMA. And I should mention, over her lifetime, she's had over 75 solo exhibitions and more than 150 group exhibitions. So, I mean, her work is always hot. But at this particular show at MoMA, somebody said that they had met Cindy Sherman there. They thought they had seen her. And so the wonderful public radio show, This American Life, put it out to their listeners to say, did anyone else think that they ran into Cindy Sherman in disguise at the exhibition? And so they interviewed 3 different people who thought that they had seen her there and maybe even engaged with her. At the end, they called up Cindy Sherman and asked her about it. And she said, none of those people were me, which I would expect, but we'll never truly know. Maybe some of you have seen the Netflix show Inventing Anna that came out earlier this year. I think it was about a young woman who committed financial crimes, really staggering financial crimes, but this whole continuing thread in the show is how she changes her identity and completely adopts, like, new hair, new outfits according to who she's trying to be. And they directly connect her to Cindy Sherman. She stands in an art gallery, and in this image, they're not looking at the Sherman, but she talks all about who Cindy Sherman was, and then eventually does a whole choreographed fashion show, essentially, every day that she winds up in court. So big ideas and our big takeaways on Cindy Sherman tonight. 3 works we didn't get a chance to look at tonight, but I think they give us a good sense of the breadth here. Sherman is a true chameleon. She has given us the beautiful, the reverential, the silly, the satirical, and sometimes the downright ugly. I don't even know what to make of this woman over here on the right. Sherman has explored image making and stereotypes, archetypes, and historical and literary references to produce a profound commentary on women in society. She's been hailed as one of the greatest women artists of all time, and hopefully after tonight's program, you think she might be deserving of that honor. So I will end there for now, and I welcome any questions or comments you might have about Cindy Sherman and her work. And I'll start looking at the chat here. Rosamond says she seems to start off pretty normal, but she ends up so bizarre. You have to wonder about her thought process. You really do, Rosamond, isn't it? I mean, she goes to real extremes, but I'm sure she's just always pushing boundaries. And I think she is always trying to avoid being pigeonholed as this one thing. It's really fascinating to me that she's willing to engage or willing to take on these characters that I think are really hard to look at in many ways. Roland, thank you for your kind words, and you too. Asmita, so true. There really is a place for everyone in art. Thank you for your kind words. Mary Jane says, astounding, have never heard of her. What a talent. Mary Jones, I should say. Thank you so much for that comment, because I agree. I only knew a little bit about her going into it, and it was such a pleasure to just get to know her. And apparently Cindy Sherman is like a lovely person. She's dated Steve Martin, David Byrd. She was married to a French filmmaker for quite some time, but she's described by like every interviewer as just being a wonderfully kind person. It would be fascinating to, have dinner with Cindy Sherman and really pick her brain. Let's see here. Karen says, so interesting. I thought her early photo where she transformed from bookish person to a vamp had an intermediary stage where she looked like a mime. I would completely agree. It feels like her entire career is about imitating others. Yeah, I love that idea of sort of the concept of looking at somebody else and thinking, I'm going to paint their face on mine. What an interesting take, right? Lynn, thanks for your kind words, and Trisha. Judith, your comment, one shot is so evoking as much as a whole movie. Exactly right. I feel like we could write a script just based on each image that we saw tonight. Oh, and Trisha had some experience with her going back to the 80s. And yeah, I mean, like, Cindy Sherman has basically been like this favorite in like gender studies and feminist studies for a long time. And I think, all of these pigeonholes she's been trying to resist, but in so many ways she fits them very well. And she certainly creates great opportunities to talk about things like female archetypes and stereotypes. So I think we got through most of the comments. Thank you again, everybody, for spending your evening with me. It's always a pleasure to share these programs. And as always, if you have any questions, suggestions, or corrections, please feel free to get in touch with me on my website. I am culturally curious. I have a lot of other programs coming up in the weeks ahead, virtual, free, online. So you can go to the calendar page of my website and find the links for those programs too. So thank you, everybody. Take good care. And I will see you next month for Winslow Homer, War and Peace and Winslow Homer. Thanks, everybody. Take care. Bye.